sharing Buddhist psychology. So David has been sharing Chan meditation for over 15 years, leading intensive meditation retreats and classes over the world. He had been a Buddhist monk for over a decade, and he was one of the Western monastic with Chan Master Sheng Yen. He holds a master's degree in mental health counseling and is currently a New York State licensed counselor. He also has his own life mentoring and coaching practice, guiding people in their cultivation of wisdom and compassion on an individual basis. So, before we start, a quick note before I hand it to David, in case you have any questions during the talk, please take note of them and wait until the Q&A session at the end of the talk. And also, if you haven't, please switch your cell phone to silence mode. Okay, with that, I'll hand over to David.
Okay, can you hear me clearly? Okay. Just want to double check my phone too. Convenience. Okay, so thank you for coming out tonight. I'm excited to talk about this topic. Are you excited to listen?
Yes.
Okay. I got so excited that I prepared the lecture, but realized that I probably should have prepared a PowerPoint because it gets a bit technical in some areas. Buddhist practice or Chan practice, meditation, is very simple. But sometimes Buddhist theory, especially the theory of Buddhist psychology, can be complicated. So, because the PowerPoint didn't work out, I may use this just to jot a few notes, so that as I'm going through these technical terms, you can stay with me. Because especially if this is the first time hearing some of these terms, it can be confusing. So I'll try to make it as clear as possible. And I'm also curious, how many of you have read or done research in Buddhist psychology? Anyone? Okay. What about Western psychology? Anybody professional? Counselor? Psychologist? Professor? No? Okay. So we're all amateurs here. Perfect. So if I say anything wrong, you wouldn't know anyway. Well, that's good, because we can start fresh. And I also hope to present a little bit about Western psychology in general, before then talking about Buddhist psychology. Just so we have a basic comparison. I think it can be helpful. Because if you've either grown up here or you've lived here for some time, most folks have heard somewhat of Western psychology terms. And our system of education even uses some of these concepts. So I'll start with that and then work into the Buddhist psychology part. And if there's time, talk a little bit about how we can actually practice this, how we can make use of it in our daily life. And I want to say that first as well. This Western psychology, Buddhist psychology, it can be kind of heady and intellectual, but we should look at it as a tool to help us practice or apply it to daily life. We can approach it in a more intellectual fashion, but it won't really help us much. So if we look at all of this that I'm about to say tonight as a kind of map, or even an instruction manual, so that when we have these concepts, we can actually apply them to how we live our lives, and so that we can use them to actually be happier. And this is really the ultimate use of them, to be happier, to be freer, more fulfilled. So let's start with what we can call Western psychology, modern psychology. Modern psychology looks at mental illness as something that only some people are afflicted with. So this could be, for example, when we're mentally unwell, we may end up in the hospital. Or if we're mentally unwell, it may be difficult to function in our daily life. Maybe somebody who has struggled with either anxiety or depression. When it gets to a point where we can't function well, it interferes with our life, then it's considered mental illness. When we return to a state of equilibrium or functioning well, we're generally healthy, then it's said that a person doesn't have mental illness. So just keep that in mind. From this Western psychology standpoint, this mental illness is, only some of us have it some of the time. Kind of like we get a cold, we get better. We're not ill. So, because of that, Western psychology has a pathology of illness. So it looks at all these different conditions and it puts them in categories. Like anxiety is one category. So there are these disorders where a person is afflicted with a kind of anxiety. Could be a social anxiety, could be just a general feeling of anxiety all the time, and so on. There are categories. Depression is the same. There are different categories of depression or conditions of depression. And in Western psychology, this is the symptoms are associated very, very clearly with the disorder. So the whole condition of mental illness is categorized into distinct, separate disorders with separate conditions. Other conditions which we don't hear often of in more less professional presentations of mental illness is there's personality disorders. These are more deeply embedded patterns of behaving and living that also create a lot of suffering. For example, one kind of personality disorder is someone wants attention all the time. We may just say, oh, this person's an attention seeker. But it could be to the point where it's a disorder, where their attention seeking disrupts their life and can even lead them to have very destructive behavior. So when is it mental illness? When is it a disorder? According to Western psychology, it has to get to a point where it really affects our daily life functioning. If it really interferes with our work, our family life, our ability to take care of ourselves, then it's called a disorder. Okay? You may have heard of things like psychosis, schizophrenia. These are disorders where a person has beliefs and ideas that seem very far from reality compared to the way we see the world. For example, a person who is suffering from psychosis may believe that, I know this one person who, he believed that his room was a spaceship, and at any time the spaceship could just lift off. There was a period of time he believed that, he truly believed that. Other kinds of psychosis are where a person has these delusions that people are following them. So they may believe, and if you've seen the movie A Beautiful Mind, seen that? Yeah, a lot of those. What did he believe? He believed, I think it was the government, people in the government were chasing him, always after him. Interestingly, many people who have psychosis have this kind of similar delusion. They believe that some kind of authority is after them, chasing them, wants to poison them or hurt them. So we call that delusion, a kind of delusion, paranoid delusion. And they're, in Western psychology, these are categorized disorders, and there's also different theories of how to deal with them, and different theories of how mental illness comes about, how mental illness can be resolved. There are many, 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 many different theories. But to simplify everything, the similar process among all these different theories of how to heal a person when they're suffering from mental illness, Western psychology focuses on the content of the mind. Meaning, what is the person thinking, feeling? What are the thoughts, the emotions, and behavioral patterns? It focuses a lot on this content. What's happening with this person? What are they thinking that drives them to psychosis? Or what are they feeling in terms of depression? It's a close analysis of the content of the mind. And the process is often to identify this content and change it. Through treatment, change the way a person thinks, change through different methods how a person feels, and of course, changing behavior. I'm going to speak very abstractly in the beginning, but bear with me, because I don't want to get too much into Western psychology. The topic is Buddhist psychology. And after going through this process of changing the way of thinking, which changes the emotional state, changing behavior, the goal is to have a healthy sense of self, a healthy, functioning self. So that when it's time to go to work, you go to work. It may be difficult, but it's okay. The person feels they can face the difficulty. When it's time to deal with family, they can deal with it. It's difficult, but a person can function and do what needs to be done with a basic sense of health and well-being. So keep that in mind. A healthy, stable sense of self is the goal of Western psychology and the treatments based on that. So let's just look at an example. For some people who are suffering from depression, in Western psychology there's a lot of detail on what are the symptoms. For example, loss of interest in life, fatigue, wanting to sleep all the time, even feeling very slow. You may speak slower, move slowly. When we're depressed, we may not want to eat anything, or maybe we want to eat a lot. It talks about all these different symptoms. And what do we do to help someone if we identify that, oh, this is depression. We identify this ailment, this mental illness is depression. We can first address their thinking. One approach may address, what is this person thinking that makes them depressed? And we may find that this person has a pattern of thinking which we could say is negative. You may be thinking, oh, my life is terrible because I'm not successful, I don't have this, I don't have enough money, I'm not making as much money as my friends, or I don't have what these people have. Nobody likes me. So, why make friends if nobody likes me? And, why try for a better job? Because probably going to fail anyway. Right? It's negative pattern of thinking. Would you say that's negative? Fairly negative. One way to help the person is to explore why do you think that way? What makes you think that way? And is that true, that your life is miserable? Is it true that you're not successful? And through exploring what are they thinking, the content of their thoughts, we can maybe help them review it and even change it. And discover that, hey, my life isn't really that bad. I can walk, I can breathe, I can use my hands to do things. I may not have that much money, but hey, getting by. I have some friends. Even one or two people love me, care about me, I care about them. To help them readjust their way of seeing or their way of thinking. That's one approach. For example, in dealing with depression, addressing the content and seeing if that content could be changed through the process of therapy, and even through their own exploration. Other techniques could be to help the person find a more healthy way of living. Do more exercise. It's found that a lot of intense exercise can help with depression. To get the body moving fast, doing things that are difficult. Intense exercise shows to be very effective for dealing with depression. So that's using behavior to then change the content of the mind. So by exercising a lot, the person will just feel good. It's like, wow, I feel really good when I move. Like, maybe a lot of us could do more exercise too, right? We know it's good. We know we feel good when we do it, but we often don't do it. We may feel kind of sluggish and down sometimes. So it's using behavior to then change how we feel and also change the content of the mind. That's one example of this Western model of dealing with mental illness. Depending on the specific condition, there can be specific ways to change the content of the mind to help a person come back to a healthier state of a sense of self. Another thing that's quite unique about Western psychology is that one approach is to make whatever is unconscious within us. Basically, we may not be aware of some of the thoughts and feelings that are buried within us. We may often distract ourselves and try to not feel pain, not feel or think the thoughts and feelings that are uncomfortable or painful. With the process of psychotherapy, through talking, the therapist can help reveal what's buried, reveal what's unconscious, make it conscious. So then you can work with it, right? If you can't see what's in there, how do you change it? So you may have to bring it out through therapy, through talking. Through that process of making things conscious, a person can develop insight. What is insight? Well, insight in this context often means an understanding of why we're ill, why we think and feel the way we do. So, for example, maybe a person has a kind of social anxiety. So whenever they're in social situations, they freeze up. They don't know what to say, they don't know what to do. It's very uncomfortable. Possibly through the process of therapy, they may reveal that one reason for this social anxiety is because their experience of socializing in the home was very scary. So with mom and dad when they were younger, or with their siblings, they may have been criticized all the time, laughed at for whatever they said, criticized. What are you talking about? That's stupid. You don't know what you're talking about. If you say that to a child enough, right? They're going to believe it. They're going to shut down. They're going to feel uncomfortable when they encounter social situations, possible. So one insight could be, through therapy, a person who realized, oh, wow, that's what it was like when I was younger. I would freeze up because mom would say something, or big brother would do something all the time. And by intellectually understanding that, by becoming aware of that, buried in the mind, by understanding it, then a person can feel pretty good, actually just understanding why they're so anxious in social situations. Number two, then they could choose a path to deal with it. So what do I do now? Maybe I go to Toastmaster. Folks with social anxiety will go to Toastmaster and practice giving toasts or different things like that. So this insight often refers to an intellectual understanding of why we're ill. And there are different modes of therapy. I won't get into that now, but the details. But in general, Western psychology, any and all therapies focus on the cognitive part of a person, or thinking, the emotional side of a person, what they feel, and behavior, what we do based on what we think, what we feel. So cognition, feeling, and action. Buddhist psychology. I'm getting to the topic. Buddhist psychology. And for today I'm drawing on teachings from Buddhist sutras as well as commentaries. In particular, there's a tradition called consciousness only. Consciousness only, sometimes it's called manifestation only. Chinese is 唯识, 意识的识. From the standpoint of Buddhist psychology, mental illness is not limited to some people. Everyone is mentally ill from the Buddhist perspective. All of us here are mentally ill. I hope you don't feel insulted by that, but I'll explain. All of us are mentally ill. Why? Well, from the Buddhist perspective, the human condition, our condition is that we are suffering to some degree. Everyone. Whether we're functioning well or not, we're all suffering. And we could say we're all deluded. We're all delusion. Some are nodding heads very, very in agreement. It's not that some of us are deluded some of the time, but we're all deluded. Do we all believe that this room is a spaceship in order to be deluded? No, that's not what it means. And I'll talk more about that, but everyone is mentally ill to some extent, and this is the human condition. So when analyzing this human condition, Buddhism doesn't categorize things into individual disorders or individual conditions. Although Buddhism does label kinds of suffering, like anxiety. That word was even used in the sutras. It's sometimes translated as anxiety, restlessness, remorse, like an unhealthy kind of guilt, anger, craving, jealousy. What else? Just kind of basic labels for kinds of suffering. Very relatable mental states. Fear, joy, excitement. Buddhism looks more at the root of all kinds of suffering. It doesn't get caught up in categorizing or dealing with mental illness as individual kinds of illness. It just looks at the root. What is the root cause of suffering? What is the root cause of mental illness? The process of Buddhist psychology, which is it safe to assume that most of you here are familiar with Buddhism, or is anybody here for the first time hearing about Buddhism? Okay, really? Okay. So, the goal of Buddhist, we could call it treatment, Buddhist treatment for our mental illness, or treatment for suffering. The goal is also insight, but it has a different meaning. Insight in Buddhist context doesn't just mean an intellectual understanding, but that's still important. We still need to intellectually know, what am I doing as I'm practicing Buddhism? We need to know intellectually. But insight refers to a complete new way of seeing ourselves, or a clear way of seeing and experiencing ourselves and life that relieves suffering. And it's sometimes called enlightenment, 开悟, 成佛, 开悟, Buddhahood or enlightenment. It's a kind of an accurate way of seeing ourselves and the world. It's really nothing mystical and nothing outside of us. It's just a different way of seeing, a different way of experiencing. And how does that enlightenment come about? Well, since we're not dealing with just the symptoms, we're not just trying to help us feel better, to feel less depressed or to feel less anxious, or just to function better. Since Buddhism talks about or looks at the root of suffering, then the transformation within a person is also a transformation at the root, you could say. Or it's often called the transformation at the base of our consciousness. The most basic way that we experience the world can change. And not only with Buddhist practice or Buddhist psychology, part of the goal is to have a healthy self, healthy sense of self, to have a sense of well-being, but it goes a step further in dissolving or resolving self-attachment. Meaning, this may sound bizarre at first, but meaning the goal is to be released from our sense of self, even a healthy one. Even a healthy sense of self, from the Buddhist perspective, is mental illness. That may sound strange, but even a healthy, stable, happy sense of self is a problem. Because even that healthy, stable sense of self is, we could say, fragile and subject to suffering. Happy sometimes, potentially very unhappy at other times, and caught in cycles of happiness, unhappiness, peace, or chaos. So with Buddhist psychology, it's the goal, we call it as selflessness, which comes about by having an accurate view of the world, or accurate experience of ourselves in the world. We even have to use that word self. But you'll see how that's no problem. So with Buddhist psychology, it's not so much we're changing the content of the mind, but actually that is also part of it. So for example, with Buddhist practice, there are behavioral practices. Right? Within Buddhism, within all religion, there's an ethical code, right? What to do, what not to do. Not to kill, steal, lie, have affairs, get intoxicated. as well as for monastics, there are even more detailed kind of rules and guidelines of behavior that help us to do behavior which is wholesome and leads to a healthy way of being, and to not to do the behavior that's unwholesome, that leads to more suffering, more problems. So that's behavioral. That's the same, it's very much the same as the Western approach. It addresses behavior. Buddhist practice, folks do a lot of meditation, right? One function of meditation is what? What's the first thing you think of when you think of meditation? Don't say leg pain. Besides leg pain. What's that?
Finding yourself center.
Finding yourself center? Okay. So could that be clarifying, becoming more clear mentally? Mental clarity? And balance? Yeah. Balance and this sense of calming. Meditation can calm the mind, especially calm the emotions, which is also similar to Western psychology addressing the emotional part of a person. Meditation is partly to calm one's emotions and to calm one's chaotic thinking. That's samadhi. So if behavioral is precept, emotional, we're dealing with emotion. Part of that is samadhi, or meditation. Actually, it just means mental stability. Wisdom, the third practice of Buddhism, actually first addresses our cognition. Part of the wisdom of Buddhism is we actually need to learn concepts to give us direction. We need to learn, what is this path? What am I doing? What is suffering? What is enlightenment? What comes in between? All of that is a conceptual map. So by learning that map, and even learning just a different way to look at things, that's a conceptual change. Part of wisdom is a conceptual change. So for example, Buddhism talks a lot about impermanence, right? Why does it talk about impermanence? Well, probably because we feel a lot of the time things are permanent until something goes wrong. Then we're like, wow, life is impermanent. So we're usually thinking and acting as if our own life is permanent, everything we see around us is permanent. Maybe that's why we don't cherish things as much, or that's why we're not so careful. And then something happens, then we sort of notice impermanence. The concept of impermanence can help us not be caught in the idea of permanence. Not be caught in thinking patterns that make things seem permanent. It's a kind of reminder. So that's conceptual. That part is conceptual. However, wisdom also refers to an experiential change. So not that we just think about impermanence, but wisdom as an experience is to really observe deeply. Observe ourselves deeply. Observe everything inside and outside of us deeply, so that we actually see change. Or not necessarily with vision, but we experience change from moment to moment. So we're not surprised by change, because every moment we experience change. So I'm just going through this kind of very briefly, the comparison of Western and Buddhist psychology. So there's two ways of experiencing, according to Buddhist psychology. There's one way to experience ourselves in the world that leads to suffering. That way is ignorance. Ignorance. We see ourselves, we see things, they seem so permanent, and they also seem so separate. You are just you, I am just me. The town over from us is just that town. Or country outside of our country is just that country. It doesn't have anything to do with us. A lot of the time our way of seeing separates ourselves and everything, so that things don't seem to have much of a relationship. So that's probably why we take our trash and we throw it somewhere else. We send our trash to a place that seems like very far away. It's not going to hurt us. Or we just bury it, right? Let's just bury the trash. You can't see it. It's not going to hurt us. Seems like it's taken care of because it's away from us. It's separate. But what we found out was that if we bury trash or just throw it anywhere, what happens is it can end up in our water. Bury the trash, or you just have a landfill that's like in the other neighborhood, well, it may percolate into the water, which ends up in our neighborhood. So we're really not separate from that neighborhood and that trash. It's now in our water, it's now in the body. So this is what it means when we say we're ignorant. We don't see the relationship, the intimate relationship between all things, and we see things as very fixed and permanent. That leads to so much suffering. I think we probably all like to be young forever, or at least for a little bit longer. Maybe some people don't want to be. But for those of us who would like to be, we probably may spend a lot of money on trying to be young, trying to look young. I just saw this guy on TV. I think he's in his 40s, maybe 50s, but he's trying to regain what an 18-year-old or his 18-year-old self was like. How? One thing is, he's changing his diet, he's exercising, he looks great, he's really fit, so he looks good, he looks young. It looks like he's in his 20s in terms of his physical strength. But he's also using different machines, different lotions, and even machines to make his hair stop becoming gray, like some sort of ultraviolet or something. Wears this thing in his head so the hair doesn't turn gray. Uses all these products and these lasers to make his skin look glowing. All this kind of stuff. I forget all the other details. Taking like 60 supplements a day to try to regain youth and even maintain it so that it doesn't age. That's an extreme. That's an extreme situation. But is it possible that in our lives we really want some things to be permanent? People in our lives. There's some we wish were here, we could be together forever. And maybe it seems like they're just always going to be around until impermanence becomes obvious, and then we suffer all over because we just didn't expect it. We lived as if it was permanent. We lived as if we would always be together. So Buddhist psychology looks at this as the root. This is one way of seeing, one way of experiencing. The other way is an awakened way of experiencing. We experience impermanence. So since moment to moment we experience impermanence, there's really no reason to try to hold on to anything or expect anything will stay the same. From our health to a relationship, to our job situation. We experience moment-to-moment impermanence. So that person just wouldn't hope something was permanent, cling to it as permanent. Also, with a more wakeful or awakened way of seeing things, this person would not be solely focused on themselves, or let's just say their family, or even just who they identify with. A person who is awakened or living wakefully sees the relationship between everyone. Meaning, we would still care about the people across town, or in the other town, or in the place across the world. Why? because their well-being is completely integrated with our well-being. If they're suffering, eventually we'll suffer. Closer to home, even within our family, maybe we're just kind of caught up in ourselves, thinking about our own problems, troubles that have at work, troubles with this person. We may be so focused on ourselves we don't even see that the person right next to us could use some care, could use some help, even just some attention. And if we took care of that person, they'd also be able to take care of us. Or the family or that household would be healthier if people saw each other's suffering and well-being as really integrated. But it's hard when we're often thinking about ourselves. We just forget about other people. So 2 ways of experiencing. Ignorant, suffering. Awakened, experience ease, freedom, joy. I'd like to talk about within the treatment of Buddhist practice based on Buddhist psychology, this process going from ignorant to awakened is also a process. It takes time. In the same way that Western psychology approaches for healing and treatment, it takes time. You can't just say, if someone's depressed, snap out of it. Or just think positively. We've given our friends advice like that. Just don't think like that. Just think positively, or just snap out of it. That doesn't work. Why? Because the pattern of thinking, or the pattern of suffering, is so ingrained. How many times have you wanted to change a habit, and it's just really hard? Even just like trying to wake up a little earlier. That's really hard. Now imagine just changing the way we think about ourselves and the world. So it's a gradual process of healing. We could say in both traditions, it's a gradual process, and there's a gradual changing of the content of the mind. But there's also a sudden transformation. In the Buddhist context, this transformation of being ignorant and confused to awakened and clear can be just a moment apart. One moment we could be full of suffering, full of pain, seeing everything as permanently bad. We're just in this terrible situation. We're stuck. We're permanently screwed. Permanently in trouble. It's possible, actually, the next moment to be free of that. But does it mean this person would be suddenly and permanently awakened and free of trouble? No, it doesn't mean that, and likely not. However, there can be moments of experiencing clarity. Or there can be moments of experiencing impermanence, experiencing this selflessness, this integrated relationship with everything. There can be moments of that just happen due to practice, or that you could even say happened by accident. But that for a moment a person can have this view, have this experience, this liberating experience. It's called sudden awakening, or a sudden transformation. Sudden awakening is often talked about, but it's preceded by gradual practice. Doesn't mean you don't have to do anything, you just like snap your fingers and you'll be free. But the gradual practice of healing and transformation, has moments of sudden awakening or sudden insight into things as impermanent and integral. So Buddhism talks about time. It also talks about it doesn't depend on time. A person's process of healing is individual and different. Are you with me so far? Yeah? Okay. So this is kind of the general picture of mental illness, mental health. Western side, suffering and awakening in the Buddhist side. I'd like to talk about consciousness. In Buddhism, the word consciousness is used. Sometimes the word mind is used. What else? Consciousness, 心意识. Consciousness, mind, sometimes intention, but usually consciousness, mind, heart, sometimes you'll hear that thrown around. Awareness, right? That's another English translation that's used often. Awareness. Within the Buddhist tradition, consciousness, in this consciousness-only school, is broken down into different aspects, which I'd like to talk about now. Sometimes it's talked about as 8 consciousnesses. Sometimes it's talked about as 4. You probably didn't realize you had 8 minds, or 8 consciousnesses. It doesn't mean you have some sort of 8 minds within you. It just means that there are 8 functions of what we call mind or consciousness. You can simplify it into 4 functions. So the first few functions are sense consciousness, meaning sight, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, right? Very easy to understand. This is the sense consciousnesses, which are 5. What are they? Sight, or seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, what else? Touching, tactile sense. That's 5. Right? Those are the 5 sense consciousnesses. Then there's what's called mind consciousness, which it's not very explanatory by just saying it's mind consciousness. But you could think of it this way. It refers to the intellectual function of thinking, memory, imagination. So all the words and images, that's what's referred to as mind consciousness. However, mind consciousness also has a function to pay attention. The ability to direct our attention also belongs to this function, mind consciousness. So for example, if you're sitting here, you could be paying attention to my voice if you're interested. And you hear my voice and it makes sense to you, right? If you're not interested, you could be sitting there like this, just thinking about stuff. So you hear my voice, but it doesn't make any sense. 听而不到. You hear stuff, but it's nonsense. It doesn't make sense. So we need attention to make sense of things. That's part of making sense of language. We would need to pay attention, right? Which also includes the practice of mindfulness, which is intentional attention, right? We have this intention to focus on something, to be aware of something. We could say, in general, that's mindfulness. Right? With me with that one? Mind consciousness. Next, we have what's called, this is not an English word, but interestingly, this word is this Sanskrit word, manas. It can be translated as grasping consciousness. And I believe in Spanish, what's the word for hand in Spanish? Isn't it mano? Mano, right? I think Spanish and other languages have their root in Sanskrit. So it's kind of interesting. Grasping. This is grasping consciousness. So think of it as a hand. You could think of it as your own hand grabbing yourself.
Manipulate.
It has that meaning, yes. What does this grasping consciousness mean? Let's first talk about the last one first, which we can call the base consciousness, which is often called the store consciousness. Have you heard of that before, that term? Store consciousness. In Chinese is 藏识. 藏, like zang is 仓库, right? Like a storage. Storehouse. Yeah, right. It's often referred to as the eighth consciousness. So the first five are these sense consciousnesses. The mind is the sixth conscious function. Seventh consciousness is manas. The eighth is the store, the base consciousness. So they're not separate, it's just different functions. It's all the same mind, it's all the same consciousness, it's just different functions. So what is this store consciousness? Store consciousness just refers to the function of being able to store or maintain all of our experience. Whatever we've seen, touched, whatever we've thought about, whatever we've encountered, even the feelings, as well as the habits that we have. So it's not only memory. When we think of memory, right, we often think of brain. I remember because I have a brain, and when our brain is damaged, the memory may also be damaged. Brain factors into Buddhist consciousness, but it's not talked about so much because it's just one organ, it's part of the whole person. Buddhism talks about consciousness in terms of experience. So brain is in here. Brain has a function in the store consciousness. Brain has a function in grasping, in intellect, right? We need a brain to think. We also need a brain to see. So it's there within all of it. But the store consciousness, including memory, also includes habits. Why do we have tendencies to still do the same thing over and over? Repeat patterns of behavior. Feelings. Sometimes we have a feeling that we've almost felt before. We feel a similar feeling. All of this is stored. So the capacity to store and maintain these experiences, as well as to what's called mature these different seeds. We could look at all of our experiences as seeds. They also change. These things go through change. Look at the story that you told today. If you tell it again tomorrow, it's probably going to be different. Different things happen to you. A habit that we have, maybe we have a habit of, we have bad temper. That habit is not exactly the same, but it's based on this tendency that's stored, and it changes over time. A bad temper could get worse, right? So that's one way it matures. It can get worse. A bad temper could get better, or less intense. But maturing in a different way. It's changing in a different way. All of this happens sometimes without even thinking about it, without even being aware of it. It happens, we could say, in the unconscious. It happens without trying. This is part of the meaning of this store consciousness. So think of it as a storehouse for everything. Storehouse for your experience. Okay? That's clear, right? This grasping consciousness, what is that? This is the key thing within Buddhist psychology. The key problem is this grasping. Grasping at what? Grasping at a self. What does that mean, grasping at a self? This grasping function of the mind is where there's a tendency to identify with the store, to identify with the most basic way of being aware, a conscious being, and thinking that it's a self, thinking that it's a separate, somehow, me, permanent. The base consciousness, it's not a thing really. It's not like you could find it somewhere inside us. Or split us open and find, oh, there's the store. You know, it's not a thing, it's just a function, a capacity, right? Kind of like hearing. Is it something inside of us that's like just there, that can just hear, and that's where hearing comes from? Is it the eardrum that allows hearing? It's like it's not only the eardrum, it's the nerves, it's the brain, it's everything working together to even have hearing. All of these consciousnesses are in the same way. They're a capacity, but they're not a thing. So reflect on that for just a second. If our mind is a thing, then it would be like located somewhere, right? It's like, yeah, my mind is like, it's in my head, I guess. We probably never think of it. You just say, oh, my mind, I got something on my mind. Well, where is your mind? There's a whole Buddhist sutra based on this question. Where is your mind? Can anybody take it out and just show it to us? Do you remember the Zen story, the Chan story of Bodhidharma? The disciple said, where's my mind? I can't find my mind. He's like, show me, give it to me, and I'll help you calm it. If you can give it to me. 你把心拿来，我帮你安. Right? That was the story of Bodhidharma. It's also pointing out the mind is not a thing in a certain location. It can't be found. But that, we could say, consciousness has function. Manas tries to find the mind, tries to find ourself, and says, there must be somewhere in here. This is myself. So if you grab yourself, you can try it. What do you grab onto? This is actually my shirt. So if I go like this, is this myself? This is just my neck. He said, well, if I could, I would grab onto the whole thing. Even if we could grab onto the whole thing, it's like, is that the self? The changing whole thing? When you clip your fingernails, does that mean like part of yourself is here and part of yourself is on the floor now? So with consciousness, manas is trying to find the self. So it's a function of looking for the self and actually just creating the self with an image. A subtle kind of image that makes it feel that there's something permanent. So how can we kind of visualize this? Well, just think of the screen. Actually, I don't know if this works with this analogy, but with the digital screen, is it true that it's flashing very fast, but it looks like it's a stable image? Anybody good with technology? Is that true?
When the pixels change color, yeah.
Yeah?
It's like right now, no.
Not right now, no?
No,
Okay.
it's just on. But when
Okay.
when it needs to change color, it does.
Okay.
Then it flashes.
So then think of the old school projectors, where there's cells, right? You move the cells fast enough, and it just seems like it's a thing, it's a movie. When it's slowed down, it's just these individual cells. Manas, or this grasping, is one moment after the next, creating an image to make it feel like there's a consistent, continuous me at the center of all this experience. And it's a kind of sense of security. It's a kind of feeling that something is the same and safe, secure. This is the meaning of attachment in Buddhism, self-attachment. creating a feeling of permanence when there is no permanence there. So reflect on your own thoughts. Are any thoughts in our mind permanent? They just kind of come up and they stay there? It's hard to say. Sometimes it feels like it's permanent. We're worrying about something. It's like, yeah, I've been worrying about this all day. At least it's been in my head all day, right? But if we look closely, and the practice of meditation can show us this, it's not that there's just a thought that's just stuck in our head. We're thinking about it over and over. We're obsessing about this thing we're worrying about over and over, moment after moment, like projecting an image on the screen. Manas is a bit more subtle than, our thinking. Our thinking has words and images, right? Pictures and language. That's what happens with mind consciousness. Mind consciousness is the screen that's showing all these images. They get the images from where? From the store. Right? How do we think about something? Well, we have to have seen something before in order to say, when I say tree, what comes to your mind is probably something you call a tree that you've seen before, so you bring it into mind. It shows up in mind consciousness. That's like the display. Store consciousness is like the hard drive. Stores everything. But different than a hard drive in that it's constantly changing. Manas is grasping at the idea that somewhere within this whole process, there's something permanent, and that's me. That's myself. That's the source of the problem. Buddhist psychology looks at attachment, grasping at self. Self-attachment as the source of all of our suffering. And why? Well, because if we attach to ourself as being real, we'll attach to everything. We won't want ourselves to change. We won't want other things to change. That's complete in opposition with reality, right? The self, the basic belief in the self, is in opposition to reality, which is change, which is integration. Self means permanence. It means separation. And in terms of experience, because of this, our mind is just busy, noisy, right? It's constantly working to keep this image there, to keep this self there. That's a tough job. So it's said that with manas, it's working all the time. But it's this very tiresome process. It's like trying to hold something without letting go, right? If I were to just say, here, hold this cup for me, but you can't let go. You have to hold it for 24 hours. If it was empty, it's probably pretty light. You're like, fine, I could hold this for like a few hours at least. I could hold it for 20 minutes. It's an exhausting thing, even just to hold your hand up, let alone holding something. So this function of grasping is exhausting. And not only that, because of grasping onto that basic image of self, then our intellectual function is also really busy. What is it busy doing? It's just busy thinking. What am I going to do tomorrow? How do I get this to happen? How do I prevent bad things from happening? How do I make sure good things happen? How do I make sure other people don't get in my way? It leads to constant thinking as well. Am I alone, or do many of you feel that you think too much? You really wish you didn't think as much. Anybody? At least one. Okay, 2, 3, 4, sometimes. The kind of thinking that we're engaged in, isn't it exhausting? Worry is just this constant, unpleasant thinking. Regret for the past is also tiresome. Even if we're happy and excited, sometimes we're so excited about something, we exhaust ourselves. Something that's really good is going to happen. We're thinking about it so much, we're also exhausted. So although our intellect isn't functioning all the time, so we sleep and have a deep sleep, we could take a break from that. But this grasping, it's happening all the time. So these are the basic functions of consciousness seen from the consciousness only sphere. What's really fun is just to look at how they are interrelated. Sometimes we just see something and we just see it. It doesn't really register, right? Or especially if we're distracted, we may be looking at something, but nothing registers. That's when our sense consciousness is operating pretty much by itself. If we saw something that caught our attention, if we see a person who is attractive, or we see a car or something, or music that we like that's attractive, not only are we seeing or hearing, but then our mind consciousness may start to jump in. And we say, oh wow, wow, look at her. Oh, wow, look at him. Oh, wow, look at that. What year is that car? Oh, I bet that's a whatever. Our mind starts to then make judgments and say, wow, that's beautiful, or that's ugly, or this is nice, or this is bad, right? All those value judgments, that's mind consciousness making use of whatever is in store, right? So at that time, I'd say all the consciousnesses are interrelated, working with each other. Sometimes, though, the sense consciousness and the store consciousness could be working without much mind consciousness at all. And when is that? Well, think of if I just took something like threw it at you, and you moved. That's not only seeing something and you're responding, but you're not thinking, oh look, that thing is coming at me, it's going to hit me, I better move. If we had to do all that thinking, we'd get hit in no time, right? So when we're navigating, let's say driving, we're just seeing, and we know not to just drive straight into things. We know to move. And if an accident is about to happen, we just suddenly move. That's because of store consciousness, or this most basic level of awareness is working with sight. But there's no time for mind consciousness. There's no time for evaluating, you just have to move. So, and they interrelate or interact in different ways too. This is just interesting to see how they overlap. It's just these different functions that are working together, sometimes separately. Mind consciousness sometimes works on its own. And when's that? Well, that could be when say you're sitting here and you're listening and you start to get tired, and you close your eyes and you start to daydream or even just dream. You fall asleep, you're dreaming. At that point, sense consciousnesses, they're not registering, right? You're not seeing or hearing, but the mind is conjuring up dreams and images. It's functioning independently at that time. Okay. So they can work independently, they can work together. And when we practice mindfulness, this is when we use our mind consciousness, we direct our attention to what we're doing. It could be seeing something, So if let's say we're working on a craft or some artwork. Any artists here? Painters? To draw? No? Okay. If you were, you're looking at what you're doing, you're paying attention, you're mindfully doing your craft. This is when mind consciousness, with mindfulness, works together with the sense consciousness. What does that do? That actually waters, you could say waters the seeds of our store consciousness. It's developing this capacity to be even more mindful. If we didn't have a store, if our mind didn't have a way to maintain this practice of mindfulness, then it wouldn't become stronger the more we practice. Right? In the same way that if we have a bad habit, it wouldn't become stronger if there was no way to store or maintain the habit. It wouldn't be a habit. We just get angry and it would just disappear. So with mindfulness, or with our practice of trying to be more aware of ourselves and how we live our lives, this is mind consciousness working with sense consciousness and developing, watering these seeds of mindfulness. So we become more and more aware. It becomes easier and easier. So think of it this way, when you practice mindfulness, when you practice meditation, you're investing in yourself, or you're investing in wisdom. Sometimes we may think, well, I was doing sitting meditation, but I didn't feel anything. I didn't feel anything, it felt pretty much the same. I've been doing it for a couple of weeks. Forget it. Probably doesn't feel anything. But actually, the more we do it, it's like this investment. It's investing in the field of our store consciousness. The more we water it, the more we do the weeding, the more we plant seed of mindfulness, the more it will grow. So this presentation of the function of the mind, it may seem like, so what's the use of it? This is one way to let us know how the practice works and develops. The more we do it, the more we develop strength in it. The more we practice, we can also learn how this manas, how this grasping is happening. And we can learn to let go of that. We can learn to not water that seed. So what happens when you don't water a seed? Does it grow into anything? Well, let's say it needs water, but we don't give it to it. It needs nutrition, but it doesn't have it. What happens to the seed? The seed will come to a point where it can never produce a fruit or a plant. So with the practice, we're also choosing not to water certain seeds. We're practicing not watering this attachment. When we meditate and we realize that we're worried, we practice letting go of our worry and coming back to mindfulness. Let's just say of our breath. That's one method. But we return to mindfulness of breathing and we let go of worry. It's like not watering that seed of grasping onto, oh no, what's going to happen? Is it going to be terrible? When we stop watering that seed dries up. The seed dies. But what happens when the seed dries up and dies? Is it useless? Any farmers here? When stuff dries up and dies, is it totally useless, or how can you use it?
The bird's gonna eat my grass seed.
They eat your what?
My grass seed.
Grass seed.
Compost.
Compost. Whatever plants or material that previously created suffering within us, the worry, the regret, the jealousy, the self-centeredness, all that vegetation, when it dries up, it becomes compost. All that energy that we spend on that stuff, is now energy for us to be mindful, or is now energy for us to do other things. It's all fuel for the mind. We could say it transforms all these different seeds and tendencies transform when we practice. So it's kind of, the more we use this theory, and the more we use analogies associated with this theory, it becomes a very kind of beautiful map of the practice. If the store consciousness is like a field, we need mind consciousness to cultivate this field. We need to have intention to not only meditate and be mindful, but we can also choose to speak in ways that foster healing, do things that are good for us, that care for us, that care for other people. This is mind consciousness doing the work of the gardener. But is the gardener working all day? Or the farmer, do they work all day and all night? No, they can't. They would pass out. They would die. So even our practice of mindfulness, even if we're not practicing 24 hours a day, the practice that we do, the field does the rest. In the same way that once you plant a seed and water it, doesn't the field take care of the rest? Whatever nourishment is in that ground, it's still working. The seed is maturing, even when the farmer or the gardener is not, breaking their back. It's all still working in our store consciousness. So anything we plant with intention will be matured, or as I said before, the process of maturing or growing in that field of mind. It's also kind of like, have you had the experience of you want to remember somebody's name, or remember something, but you can't? What was that guy's name? Can't remember. You try really hard, it just doesn't come out. You have the intention to remember, and you say, forget it, I can't remember, just forget it, let's eat. And like a minute later, it's so-and-so. It returns, right? All we had to do was plant that seed, that intention, and our mind started working. Without us trying really hard, it started processing. This organic process of looking for that information, and then it comes out. So in the same way, this practice that we have of intentionally being mindful, intentionally doing things that are wholesome, even when we're not working, even when we're not trying hard, the mind is working and developing these qualities. We are changing even when we stop trying. Okay. So some people have a question, just to throw this in there, some people have a question about Buddhism's view on the soul. And they may think, well, is that like store consciousness a soul then? Is that the soul of Buddhism? It's like when we die, that's the thing that's always there. It's like always the same, going from one life to the next, or one person to the next. No, Buddhism doesn't talk about soul. Why? Because even store consciousness is flowing and changing like a river. It has a function, but it's not a thing. It's not somehow a permanent thing. You just go back to that question, where is your mind? Where is it? It doesn't have a place. The Buddhist theory of mind, there's no location. We could say this is where the mind resides. And people say, well, could it be the brain? Well, okay, if you just take your brain out and put it on the table, by itself, if that was mind, then it would be able to work somehow. But the brain is just one part of this whole being, this whole conscious being. And to go a step further, what would our brain be without oxygen? So we don't have to take it out of our head. It's in our head, but without oxygen, without nutrients, what is the brain? So that means that the environment is integral in order for consciousness to be. So Buddhism looks at the mind, the theory of the mind, the theory of consciousness as a totality. You can't locate the mind and say that's where it is. Here's my mind, there's your mind. But mind, consciousness, there are these functions, but these functions come about from an integrated whole. This is the holistic view of the theory of mind. How do you spell holistic? Is it with a W or with just an H? Just H? No location. But there's all these functions. Any comment? How are we doing? Anybody feel tired? It's getting late. You okay? I could talk more about even more functions. I don't know if that would bore you. It's too much technical stuff. I think it could be. Yeah, it could be. But I'd just like to skip down to just to talk about modes of perception. To get back to how I said there's two ways of seeing. Remember that? One way of seeing is ignorant, the other way is awakened. In most teachings, it's very vague. It's like, so exactly how is ignorance, how are we awakened? The consciousness-only teachings talk very concretely about what that is. What is the mode of seeing that's deluded? What is the mode of seeing that's awakened and clear? Are you interested? If you're not, I won't say anything. Okay, just making sure. Consciousness only talks about three modes of perception. First mode is called direct. Second mode, by inference. The third mode is erroneous. What does this mean? It's easier to talk about what is erroneous. Erroneous perception refers to when we see something, hear something, smell something, taste something, and even think something. But the moment after, our experience is interfered with by, we said before, manas and mind consciousness. It's interfered with by an image. So just for example, if you were to look at your hand, for the first moment you're just seeing your hand. Very soon after you may start to look at, hey, what is that on my hand? You identify different shapes and colors. And look at that little line there, look at the little bump. Or you may just even have the whole shape of your hand. It's now an image burnt or imprinted on the store consciousness and now showing up again in mind consciousness. It's not just seeing anymore. There's an image overlaid on top. A thought, if you will. A concept. So after you look at your hand and you close your eyes, you could probably still see it. You probably still recall what it looked like, right? This often happens without us even noticing. We look at something and then all of a sudden we have these different value judgments. Like I mentioned before, oh, look at him, look at her. This person is so good, they're such a good person. They do this, they do that, wonderful person. It's nice to talk about someone in that way. But is that truly who they are? All these images and opinions that we have. Oh, they're such a wonderful person. Because what about our friend may say, what are you talking about? They're not a wonderful person. You know what they did last week? They did this, they did that. They have a whole other set of images and value judgments that they project. Right? This is what's referred to as erroneous perception. Because we're just making use of all these images stored in our mind to see, to experience. And we get caught in them, don't we? How many times have we had a friendship or some sort of relationship where it went really sour? And all that's left is this idea of that person. Or the flip side, a relationship where we fell in love and this person was just like the most amazing human being in our life. For a little while, till we got to know them. But falling in love, who do we fall in love with? Do we really fall in love with the person as they are? Or do we fall in love with this? The image of them. The fantasy of them. Oh, it's going to be so wonderful when we're together. It's probably very different than we imagined after spending time with the person. It's that saying, 路遥知马力. It's like you learn about the strength of a horse from a long journey, and you learn about a person just by spending much more time with them. The fantasy of who they were, like we realize, like, wow, I was in love with this complete, unreal dream. So love or hatred, these are the extremes of how we perceive through images, and they're often very erroneous. The person we hated, who we thought hated us, we bump into them, we have a conversation, and it's like, wow, everything's fine. Were you mad at me? It's like, no, what are you talking about? I wasn't mad at you. I thought you were mad at me. I didn't want to call you because I thought you were mad for like 5 months. And it was totally an erroneous perception. This is often where we are. Inference refers to when we make use of images, we make use of thoughts and ideas for a functional purpose. So for example, we see smoke at a distance. Where I'm coming from in New York, there's smoke everywhere. So actually, before it got into the news and people started paying much more attention, I smelled campfire 2 weeks ago. Like, what is this? It smells like a campfire. Is this like early party time or something? But I looked in the distance and I saw brown clouds, which is unusual. So I inferred that, I wonder if this is the forest fires that some people are talking about. I wonder if this is blowing from down there. I said, no, maybe. So I looked it up and I found, it is actually starting to blow towards New York. So I used an image to make sense of something. And in many cases this is useful. We can decide not to go outside and not go jogging when we see that or when we smell that. We make an inference and we make a decision. It's useful. But it may not be accurate. Maybe it was just a campfire. Maybe it was just my neighbors having a barbecue. Meanwhile, I shut myself in the house and I closed all the windows because I thought it was forest fire. It could be correct, it could be incorrect. This is useful and we need to think and make decisions. But we have to also be careful. We can't attach to our ideas. Once we attach, we'd be in trouble. Direct perception. What is that? That refers to when we perceive or experience without any interference from images. The first two, erroneous perception, it's just a complete incorrect idea, complete wrong seeing. Inference could be correct, could be incorrect, but either way, it's just an idea. Direct perception, whatever we see, we see. Whatever we hear, we just hear. Whatever we feel, we just feel. There's no interference, there's no conceptualization. This is probably what we often hear in Zen practice. Learning not to get caught in ideas. And we just sit. Just sitting means that we're not thinking, there's no need to think, we're just sitting. So we practice just sitting. Actually, in our daily life, there's a lot of times where we don't need to think, we don't need to make value judgments, we don't need to make any decision. Yet our mind is so busy, isn't it? We can actually practice perceiving more directly. Just see it. It's just what we see. It's just what is heard. That person, that's just what is seen. When we can perceive in this way, it's said that we can truly perceive impermanence. We can truly perceive selflessness. Why? Because there's no concept that's making things seem permanent, that's making things seem separate. It's just a kind of, we can say, fluid, free-flowing awareness of whatever is happening. A stream without any obstructions. And it's liberating. Our mind can finally rest. We finally just look, finally listen without judging, without complaining, or even without longing. We just see, we just hear. By having more and more moments of direct perception, by practicing mindfulness, having more and more moments of direct perception, less and less noise from this indirect perception, we start to see more and more clearly ourselves and the world. And it frees us. It's liberating. This is a liberating practice of just perceiving directly. Just sitting, just walking, just eating, just driving. And then, because our mind is more so in that free-flowing, calm and clear state, then when we need to make inference, when we need to make value judgments, we're also much more clear and less attached. We're more flexible. We can say, well, maybe it's this, but maybe it's that. You know, maybe you've got the right idea. Maybe I've got a piece of the truth. Instead of, oh, that can't be true. That's stupid. You don't know what you're talking about. Or I'm the one who's right. Which is often what happens with attachment. We can get stuck in our own ideas. So to summarize this practice, the Buddhist practice or the Buddhist path of treatment or healing, we attempt to use mindfulness to intentionally pay attention use our mind consciousness to intentionally pay attention, be aware of things we do in our life, eating, walking, talking, working, listening. We try to do more and more of every activity in our daily life mindfully. We're perceiving more directly, more clearly, with less interference from judgments, concepts. We're watering these seeds. We're developing this way of being. The more we do it, the more it develops, the more it grows, and the more this capacity grows. Actually, the easier it becomes. We eventually, and this is the ideal, we eventually transform our whole way of being at the base. Through this practice, we transform the whole field of our mind so that we very naturally just perceive directly. We can still think and still make assessments, but all of that grasping can be composted, transformed, so that there's no more grasping. The mind is freed from grasping. The mind is free from grasping. And it functions just very naturally, very freely. You can still see, can still hear, still think, still do things. But it's now a liberated mind. It's no longer bound in self-attachment. It's now free from self-attachment. And according to the Buddhist perspective, that's the healthiest mind. It's the healthiest way of being. It's the selfless mind. How do we really practice it? Well, I encourage everyone to come to retreats or come to meditation classes. This weekend, I'll be leading the one-day retreat, which is still open if you're interested. We have some spots left. It's 1 day of practicing mindfulness. 1 day of cultivating this field of our mind. Just through mindful sitting, mindful walking, mindful eating, mindful listening, and maybe even mindful napping. Depends on tired we are. So it's 1 day of this mindfulness practice where we don't really talk too much about this stuff. This can be complicated and can give you a headache from thinking about it. So the purpose of even talking about this tonight is not that we end up thinking about this too much, which can give you a headache, but that we actually practice it. This is just a nap. This is just one way to guide us and to encourage us in mindful living, in living more wakefully and consciously. So I'd like to save a few minutes for some Q&A, some interaction. Anybody have questions about this? What I presented? Either questions, or maybe you just want to share something, or even challenge something. You don't have to agree.
Question about the one-day retreat. If people does not have any background of practicing sitting meditation, can they still come?
Yeah, so if you have no experience, you can come. However, just be prepared that for people who have never sat before, it could be painful if you try to sit on the floor. It could be slightly painful if you sit in the chair, but much less so. But seriously, if you haven't sat ever before, it could be a bit much to do. Let's say we sit a few periods during the day. You may feel a little uncomfortable, but it's okay. You can stretch your legs if you want. So if you're not afraid of potentially a little discomfort, then sure, come. I don't know if that was encouraging or discouraging. But, let's put it this way, if it really hurts, just stretch your legs out, so don't worry about it. But you would need to be silent for the whole day. There's no talking for 8 hours or so. If you can't deal with that, don't come, actually. The worst is to have someone come and just say, I just can't keep quiet, so they're talking to everybody and asking questions. Hey Dave, where do you live? Where do you come from? So as long as you're comfortable being silent, and you're okay with sitting still for a few periods, then come along.
I have a question. I'm still trying to understand the holistic view of mind, the low location and the function. So we all, as human beings, will have different minds, right? We all have, which is we all have a function. There's no location for that. I'm just thinking about then what it is about that function. So would that be kind of energy, what do you call that? We all have different minds, we also have different consciousness. We'll behave differently, talk differently. Function is more like a mechanical term for me.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean?
Doesn't sound
So I
organic.
feel like, yeah, when you say mind, it's more, I think it's more like energy. In my analyze, when I kind of try to understand it this time. So maybe if you are able to kind of give a little bit more explanation, or I don't know if my kind of explanation of that energy, or thinking about it, that term of energy is correct.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a tricky question. If I answer it, I could, get everyone into trouble. Because you could say energy, yes, but then we don't want to think of it as some kind of energy that's just isolated or somehow like inside of us, and that this main energy is like the mind. The mind not having a location just means that whether it's energy as well as matter, our physical body also has everything to do with mind and consciousness. Whether we call it energy, matter, we can't isolate it and say it's here, or it's just this. It's everything. In order for us to be consciousness, we need everything. We need air, we need water, we need a body. We call it energy for folks who understand physics, just this even molecular look at the universe and the world. You can look at it from a molecular perspective, that's fine. But it's not isolated. You can't isolate the mind and say it's totally here. Because even though we say you have your mind, I have my mind, actually my mind right now is changing your mind. And you just changed my mind. Just by speaking the words you said, right? Stimulated some change. Whatever was in store was now moved or brought about by what you say. What I say affects what is touched or moved within your mind. Or what we do just by seeing someone do something that can change our mind, right? So it's very tricky. We really want to feel that there's somehow some separation. It's like, well, I'm moving my arm right now and you're not, right? You can't just say like, Dave, move your arm. However, you could say, can you raise your hand, please? Can everybody raise your hand? Right? And you raise your hand. So I can't control you, but my mind, my body, this environment, it's all completely integrated and affecting each other. That's what it means by no locality or no complete separation.
And it's function.
But there's still all these functions. There's the workings of seeing, hearing, smelling, thinking. But we're all feeding each other's field of mind, so to speak. We're all changing each other. This is what no self or selflessness means. So what initially seems very abstract and weird, if we look at it this way, it's very normal. We're changing each other. We're affecting each other inside and out. So where can you find a fixed mind, a fixed self? That's actually, this is our practice to now observe, not just to agree with this or to agree with me, or to agree with the Buddha, but to observe. And this is where meditation helps us start. We observe. Can I find a mind? We observe our thoughts. We may find the thoughts disappear. So where's the mind when thoughts disappear? They can come back again. They still work, right? But they don't stay. Nothing fixed about it. So this is the kind of inner observation that can help us experience this more theoretical explanation.
Thank you.
You're welcome. For those of you interested in the sutra, where the Buddha poses this question to the student, it's called the Shurangama Sutra. It's pretty heavy, especially the Chinese version. It's very difficult to read, but the English version is more accessible.
What's the Chinese?
Chinese is Leng Yan Jing, right? Leng Yan Jing. Very well. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, in your three perceptions, the first one is correct, right? So that's the right way. So how do we know there's no difference, that direct mode of perception? What's the difference between, like, we say, the simple-minded, you just look down, it's also direct image, right? How do we distinguish that? Do we practice to be dumb?
It's interesting. When we say somebody is dumb or simple-minded, I mean, we all have a different idea of what that means. It doesn't mean a person, loses the ability to judge or make even detailed assessments using images. Like a professional is someone who could think very clearly in a very detailed way about their subject matter. It doesn't mean we can't do that, but it means that our mind is not clouded by all of those ideas and judgments. So we can be simple in that respect, yes. And we don't have to. We don't need to flood our mind with all of those ideas. We can just see. We can just hear. And we can actually appreciate. Life becomes so much more amazing and wonderful because we experience just what is seen, what is heard, and what is felt without interference. It can be a kind of beautiful experience, being simple in that way. So we could be very intelligent, but we could also practice being simple, or be able to be simple. Whereas maybe if you yourself are intelligent, meaning all of us, or you know some very intelligent people, they can't stop their mind from making all those judgments and assessments. They can't stop it. It's just whenever they see something, they can't help it. That's partly the work of manas, clinging. So think of it as a storehouse that's functioning very well. When things need to be brought out and used, they can be used. When it's not necessary, the storehouse can be calm and clean and clear. Most of our storehouses are a mess. Stuff over here, stuff over there, you're trying to get something, you trip over it. And that's the deluded mind.
So we're practicing to have a clean mind when needed.
Yeah, just being simple. Not not being influenced or burdened by our own judgments, our own intelligence. Yeah. Maybe we have time for one last? Yeah.
When you were talking about neighbors and garbage and other people's issues, if you will, were you going down the path of having empathy or being empathetic, or was it something maybe deeper, bigger, like part of the whole?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Empathy, which in Buddhism we call compassion. Compassion is not just being nice, it's not just being kind, it's recognizing that the well-being of other people is our own well-being. And if we have trash and we just throw it around, then that's, poisoning others, and it's still poisoning ourselves. So yeah, if you look at it on a level of empathy and just human relations, as well as like the ecological, the bigger perspective.
Part of the whole.
Yeah. Okay. So just about time. Thank you again, everyone, for coming tonight. It's wonderful to have you listen. You listened for a long time. Let's give yourself a round of applause. Hope it wasn't too technical. Hope I mixed the technical with the practical. If you like the technical and the practical, I recommend a book by Thich Nhat Hanh, which I often use his books as reference. There's a book called Buddha Body, Buddha Mind. Have you heard that book? And the author is Thich Nhat Hanh. For a Chinese book, Master Sheng Yen has a book called, what's it called? 新的世界 what's it called? 探索世界 世界的是意识的事 It's not like world, it's almost like exploring the world of consciousness 探索世界 It also explains this whole approach of consciousness only with some practical guidance. Okay, any announcements we need to make about the center or things like that? We're all good.
Yeah, just a reminder that the Sunday voluntary retreat is still open. We have a few more seats, so feel free to join us.
Yeah. And if you want to stick around, if you had personal questions for me or you just want to chat, I'll be here for a few minutes or a while. Welcome to chat.
By the way, the voluntary retreat, we need a registration, so please go to our website and fill in the registration form if you like to join.
Okay, thanks everyone. Have a good night.
Probably end up